All right, so welcome everybody to our January program. I'm Kat Whitehouse. I am the volunteer coordinator for Ventura Audubon Society and also one of the plover biologists at Ormond. So we just have a couple little updates. Currently for the Christmas bird count, we're up to 180 species and counting with some really cool spots. We had a dusky cat flycatcher.
I got it.
Okay, a broad-billed hummingbird and even a yellow-bellied sapsucker. And we'll look for Frank's ending update in the months to come. So currently our field trips and volunteer naturalists are still in suspension pending COVID regulations, and we'll update you as we get info coming in. But we do have some upcoming events with our friends. So Frank at Wild Birds Unlimited Ventura has a Beginning of Bird ID, a winter edition. That's going to be over Zoom, and that's going to be this Saturday, January 16th at 2 p.m. and it is free to attend, so I do recommend that you all do that for you novices out there. And then the Western Foundation also has a SoCal Winter Bird ID class, and this is a 3-part series, but you can partake in one or all 3 of them. And that's going to be with Paul Grinrod, and it's an intro course on wintering ducks, raptors, and sparrows. However, that one does have a fee associated, starting at $20 for one class and $75 for all 3 of them. And now I will hand it over to Miss Sabrina, our program coordinator.
Hey everybody, I'm very excited to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Natalie Dawson. She is the Executive Director for Audubon Alaska and a teaching professor at Alaska Pacific University. She's spent 2 decades working, studying, and learning from Alaska's lands, waters, and indigenous peoples. When she's not advocating for Alaska's birds and other wildlife, she enjoys exploring by ski, kayak, and on foot. She enthusiastically shares her love of the North with others and believes deeply in the pursuit of lifelong learning from the land. Tonight in her presentation, Natalie Dawson will discuss issues relating to federal public lands and waters across Alaska, such as those pertaining to drilling and development. She'll also discuss ways to help these places in the coming weeks as we fade out of the Trump administration and into the Biden administration. And with that, Natalie, I pass you the reins.
Great, thank you. And hello, Ventura Audubon. Thanks so much for reaching out. I'm excited always to talk about Alaska. So I have a short presentation, but this can be informal and feel free to ask questions about what's of interest to you and your members. Just out of curiosity, how many members does your chapter have in total?
We think it's around 600. It's like 600 to 800. It's kind of a moving target depending upon which spreadsheet you download from National.
Oh, that's awesome. Wow, amazing. Our chapters are so important for our work, especially in Alaska. We're a really small team of 3 people right now, and we rely a lot on our grassroots network. As I'll talk a little bit about today, and as I'm sure you've seen in the news, we don't get a lot of support here in state for a lot of our priorities. So, because it's a lot of national level issues, the grassroots network within Audubon, I mean, really our chapters help us get our work done. So yeah, anyone seeing any Alaska birds right now down there? Some of you may be seeing some of the species that spend some time with us in the summer.
I would say Frank's probably the expert on that. I'm going to put him on the spot since he's.
We all have white-crowned sparrows. I mean, you got the white crowns.
Yeah, that's awesome. I spent some time in the Arctic Refuge this summer, and I had white-crowned sparrows around my tent every night. And they're such a sound of summer for me and for a lot of us up here. Cool. Well, one question I have for you that we can just think about as a group throughout this presentation is, in the coming months, given kind of the shift in the administration and in the makeup of Congress, we're looking for ways to work more closely across the flyway with members and kind of picking out bird species that are important across the Pacific flyway. So if there are species that you think of that, have a really, powerful meaning to you in California that we share with you here in Alaska, I would love to just kind of keep a running list of the birds that, make you think of Alaska and California. So that maybe we could do some joint messaging in the coming months on some of the issues I'll talk about tonight. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Sunset. Yes. Thumbs up. Okay, great. I can't really see what everyone can see. So this is our our sunset right now. We're slowly coming out of our darkness. So solstice, after solstice turns, we get about a minute of daylight added every day. And come February, we'll be up to about 5 minutes a day. So we have here in Anchorage, where I am right now, we have about 6 hours of daylight. So this is just a view from not too far from my house. And so just, I thought I would step us through what's been happening in Alaska and what is going to happen in the near future, or what we anticipate our actions will be coming up. But like I said, you may have questions about specific priorities in Alaska or issues that you've heard about. So feel free to stop me at any time. As my bio said, in my other life, I still teach, and I'm happy to just be super informal about it. I may or may not be able to see the chat while I'm talking. So if you have any questions and I seem to be glancing over them, just feel free to interrupt me. So as many of you know, I always like to start with this slide, but if you haven't been to Alaska before, it's really big. Often in Audubon brochures, we're like the state in the far left corner next to Hawaii, but that's not our geographical location. We're the largest state, over twice the size of Texas. And of course, we take up a good portion of the northern latitudes for North America. We have about 50% of the total US coastline for all of the 50 states, or all of the lower 48 states combined. So lots of coastline. We have over 60% of our nation's wetlands. Of course, we're home to the majority of our nation's federal public lands and wilderness areas. And we host hundreds of bird species every year from every flyway across North America and several Australian and Eastern Asian flyways as well. So we have a huge congregation of birds in various parts of our state, often only for the summer months. So I just always like to throw this up when we think about, traveling from even just Southeast Alaska to the North Slope in a community like Utqiagvik, talking about the distance in terms of ecological change, as if we were traveling from Miami to the northern tip of Maine. So a lot of different ecological regions that encompass the state of Alaska. All of our flyways converge in Alaska in places like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and for our seabirds in large congregations offshore and onshore in Bristol Bay. And we're also a hotspot for climate change. So Alaska is experiencing about 3 times the rate of climate change as any other state in the country. And the Arctic itself is changing over twice the rate in terms of warming compared to other parts of the globe. With that, you'll see on the right side here, this is a map that shows you the impacts of climate change that we put together for the summer of 2019. We had a really strange summer well, I don't know if I should say strange anymore. We had a summer where we saw incredible wildfires. Some of those fires were really close to our major metropolitan area of Anchorage, which isn't a major metropolitan area compared to a lot of other places, but it's our biggest city in the state. And so wildfire was on everybody's mind, but it was a really big summer across the state for wildfire. We also saw extensive seabird die-offs. There was actually just an article recently in High Country News highlighting some of these die-offs, largely due to starvation. They think with changing forage fish distributions in the Western Arctic and Bering Seas. We're also seeing an increase in village relocation needs. So we currently have about 46 rural and indigenous villages that are in imminent danger of erosion due to either river or coastal erosion and subsequent flooding. So 46 communities are needing to be moved from their current location. We saw incredible marine mammal die-offs, so whales, walruses, and some seals washed up on shore across Western Alaska, and some of these points are on the map. We saw a lot of fish die-offs, and we're seeing some changes in caribou migrations in the north. So one of the interesting things about climate change is the patterns of precipitation are changing very rapidly. And so where we used to have low snow, like if we think of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the Western Arctic, we call that, collectively the Arctic coastal plain. And it's really a large desert in a lot of ways, very little precipitation. So snowfall is actually pretty low on the coastal plain, and the Brooks Range, the northernmost part of the Continental Divide that separates the northern slope from the south slope, interior Alaska from the northern part of Alaska, has always been a pretty dry mountain range in terms of snowfall. One of the impacts of a warming ocean due to the loss of sea ice is a feedback loop that's bringing more precipitation to the very northern stretches of Arctic Alaska. And so you can imagine if you're a caribou where you once had to break through maybe 6 to 8 inches of snow, you're now having to break trail through feet and feet of snow to go, 700 miles from interior Alaska to the coastal plain on your spring migration. And of course, a large number of those animals are pregnant females. So we're starting to see real big changes in caribou migration timing. And in some cases, what that means is they're not able to get all the way to the coastal plain by the time they actually undergo calving. So a part of what Audubon does is, as you know, is collect the science to make the best conservation recommendations and the advocacy that's following on what we know about the science. And so this map is one example of how we're trying to pull together the story of, what's really happening with climate change in Alaska. How is it impacting the birds and other wildlife and the people that we want to advocate for? And so I'll talk a little bit more about that, but there's impacts of climate change that are very distinct to Alaska, like the sea ice and rain on snow events, but the impacts are shared obviously across the country. So this was a map I put together this fall for our members to kind of show, wrap our heads around what is going on in Alaska. It's been a really challenging 4 years, and whether you're conservative or Democrat or find yourself somewhere in the middle, the focus on rolling back federal regulations on Alaska's public lands and waters has been the most aggressive that we've seen in Alaska in several decades. It was really a perfect storm of our congressional delegation wanting to see some big projects out the door, like drilling in the Arctic Refuge, and people in very influential cabinet appointments like David Bernhardt leading the Department of Interior, who were former oil and gas lobbyists here in Alaska. So David Bernhardt and many of the people who make up the Bureau of Land Management now at the DC level were former oil and gas executives here in the state. And so they had a very calculated plan for how they would like to see, NEPA regulations shifted slightly so we could go back and open up areas that had been off limits to drilling for many years. So on this map, I thought I would just kind of talk us through some of the big issues that happened over the course of the last 4 years and where we stand right now. So the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, as many of you know, was protected in originally in 1960 as the Arctic Wildlife Range. It was the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge was added in 1980 under the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. And ever since then, it's been a contentious piece of the Arctic Refuge. I don't like to refer to it as the 1002 area. It's just a section in ANILCA, the law. It's the coastal plain, and it's the last 5% of Alaska's and therefore the United States Arctic coastal plain that is left undeveloped and, quasi protected right now from oil and gas development. So it's been a 50-year, and really more than 50-year battle to keep the Arctic Refuge coastal plain protected. It was included in the 2017 tax law language that was passed during budget reconciliation when Trump first came into office. And as part of that, it's now required that there be an oil and gas leasing program. This has been a legacy issue for our current senator's father, and she kind of picked up the torch after him. It's a very divisive issue in the state of Alaska, though we know across the country, most Americans on both sides of the aisle or constructed divisions tend to support not drilling in the Arctic Refuge. Just 4 days ago, by almost complete accident, an Arctic Refuge campaign was launched on a new social media platform that some of you may know. I don't know it, called TikTok. And 6 million people through that platform sent comments to the BLM asking them not to allow seismic exploration before the January 7th deadline for comments. So that was an overwhelming amount of comments, which makes me think I need to up my social media game. So as you'll hear with me, a lot of these issues, we've kind of been trying to run the clock out. So Audubon filed a lawsuit in August to stop drilling in the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge, hoping that we could hold off the oil and gas drilling program and winter seismic exploration until a new administration took over. Our fingers crossed at that time that a new administration would come into play. That's largely been our strategy in most of these public land issues, litigation. It's not my favorite tool to use, but it's often the one that needs to be used in a defensive space. And so there is current litigation going on. We had our first preliminary injunction hearing last week on Monday, so a little over a week ago. We were asking for the judge to basically stop the oil and gas leasing program and the bidding from going forward before any permits have been issued. And so it's a really hard thing to actually get a judge to rule favorably on. And our judge, who's a very fair judge, we've worked with her before, she didn't give us the preliminary injunction. So on Wednesday, they did bid for leases in the Arctic Refuge coastal plain. However, due to the significant organizing over the last several years, not a single large oil and gas company bid on any leases in the Arctic Refuge. So no ConocoPhillips, no Exxon, no BP, no Chevron, none of them bid on any of the leases. Who did bid were two very small small independent companies, one that has a few leases and on state lands adjacent to the refuge. One lease area was bid on by a company that just popped up in 2020. That's an LLC, so unlikely that it's even legal that they bid. We're looking into that. And then the majority of the leases were actually bid on by a quasi-public state corporation called ADA, the Alaska Industrial Development and Export Authority. Again, we're not even sure they can legally hold leases for drilling. So we're looking into that, but it doesn't really matter at this point because we're hopeful that the Trump administration just won't be able to get the permit paperwork done before they're out of office at the beginning of next week. So we're pretty hopeful right now that the leases will not be solidified. Even if they are solidified, there's several actions that the Biden administration can take to stall that permitting. Ultimately, though, what needs to happen is the tax law language has to be amended to remove the Arctic Refuge drilling program. Because the Arctic Refuge was included in the tax law as a financial mechanism to allow for the tax breaks that happened under that law, and because there were almost no bids on the leases. So under the tax law, we were promised as Americans $1.8 billion for opening the Arctic Refuge to oil and gas drilling. They made about $10 million on those sales a week ago. So that means that they made 0.8% of 1% of $1.8 billion. So what we can do now is actually ask for them to revise that number in budget reconciliation. And we are going to try to push for amended language in budget reconciliation early in this Congress. There's a lot of steps involved. The biggest one is actually getting Congress to support budget reconciliation and removing the Arctic Refuge language. So that's going to be a huge organizing opportunity for all of Audubon's network. We're going to have to work really closely with members of Congress to make them feel supported in pushing to remove that language from the tax law, because our own Senator Lisa Murkowski, who will continue to play an influential role in Congress, will not support the removal of that language. So we're going to have to pile on some pressure from the outside. The Western Arctic that many of you may know about, there's a huge Arctic wetland, one of the biggest wetlands in the circumpolar north called Teshikpuk Lake. Is part of the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska. That has also been opened for oil and gas drilling, but it's different than the Arctic Refuge in terms of our actions that we'll be taking. We are also suing the Trump administration on their oil and gas drilling decision for the Western Arctic, and we're hoping that that will revert back to the plan that protects Teshikpuk Lake and other important bird areas and important caribou calving areas. That's an action that can be undertaken by BLM. So we're hopeful that a new Secretary of Interior will take this on as an early action under a new administration. There's a large road proposed in Western Alaska called the Ambler Road. It's the largest road proposal in what's now a roadless region of Alaska. It's a proposed mining road, and that road has also become a point of litigation. It's a process that would require permits from BLM, the National Park Service, and the Army Corps of Engineers, and it cuts through about 4,400 acres of critical wetlands for many migratory species that use the boreal forest. It's a 211-mile road. Crosses 6 wild and scenic rivers, and it borders the southern portion of Gates of the Arctic National Park. They're saying it would be a private road. We think it might end up being a public road. In 2016, the permit was denied due to the lack of sufficient detail on environmental impact analyses. However, when Trump became president, the BLM restarted the process using the same exact permit application and didn't do any follow-up environmental analysis. So we're suing the administration on that point. Bristol Bay, as many of you may have followed, Bristol Bay is home to millions of seabirds. It's one of the most important places in North America for seabird colonies and shorebirds that many of you see, I'm sure, in the winter months. And it's home to the proposed Pebble Mine, which would be one of the largest open pit mining projects in the world. The pebble mine has been a couple decades now, a long time issue in Alaska. During the Trump administration, go back even further, during the Obama administration, the EPA ruled that the mine should not go forward because Bristol Bay is the world's largest sockeye salmon fishery and one of the world's largest remaining wild fisheries. And there was no way to have a mine there that wouldn't threaten the fishery. The EPA denied the permits. However, in 2016, when Trump came into office, he decided to renew the process. And over the course of the last few years, the Army Corps of Engineers, the state of Alaska, and the Pebble Limited Partnership, which is part of Northern Dynasty Metals, largely Canadian-owned mining company, has pushed forward the permitting process. The Army Corps was going to issue the permit late this summer. Donald Trump Jr. and a friend of his, Nick Ayers, who's a very influential Republican, happened to be on a fishing trip in Bristol Bay. And so some of our organizers got a hold of them as they were getting on a plane. This is kind of how it's done in Alaska sometimes. Bombarded them at a very small airport in King Salmon and basically said, you know, your father's about to open this place up for large scale mining. What do you think about that? And left it at that. Those two individuals got on a plane and they got on Twitter and they made some statements about how Bristol Bay is super important for birds and salmon and it should not be open to development. And boom, almost overnight, the Army Corps stalled the permitting process and said that the Pebble Limited Partnership had to submit a compensatory mitigation plan for wetlands mitigation, which is something you would think they would have had to do anyway, but this is Alaska and we don't usually require any compensatory mitigation on any wetlands destruction. A very interesting loophole that the Army Corps uses that again is probably not legal and that we've actually been looking into for the last year. But anyway, the Army Corps required this mitigation plan this fall. Pebble Limited Partnership submitted their mitigation plan. The Army Corps denied the permit. So the Pebble mine did not get their permit from the Army Corps. However, the state of Alaska, through our governor's office, is challenging that decision in court right now. They just filed 2 days ago. In the meantime, there's an action that we've had out for a while now for our members across the country, which is to veto the other part of the permit, which is the EPA permit under the Clean Water Act. So the EPA has not yet ruled on the permitting process. So we're hoping that the EPA will rule on the Pebble mine permit and veto it under a new administration. But big projects don't die easily. And so simultaneously, we are working with the United Tribes of Bristol Bay and the commercial fishermen of Bristol Bay, and there's now a formal call for protecting the fishery in perpetuity. And so we're hoping to introduce legislation this next Congress for the establishment of the nation's first national fisheries area, the J. and Bella Hammond National Fisheries Area. Jay Hammond was an early governor in Alaska right after we became, well, as we were a territory becoming a state in 1959. And he was a beloved governor. He was a wildlife biologist and a conservationist, and his wife was a Yupik woman who actually grew up in Bristol Bay. And so we felt like it would be a great way to honor their legacy in Alaska by naming a national fisheries area after them. So that's a positive story. I think we're pretty close on Bristol Bay, fingers crossed. And then we moved down to the Tongass National Forest in Southeast Alaska, nation's largest national forest, one of the world's largest contiguous portions of coastal temperate rainforest, home to ancient cedar trees. And what's happening down there right now is actually today is the 20th anniversary of the national national roadless conservation rule that was passed under President Clinton in his waning days in 2001. And it was at the time the most popular national rule in history in terms of public comments received in favor of the rule. Over 1 million comments came into the US government, the National Forest or the USDA Forest Service, saying we support this formalization of the roadless rule. What it did is it protected all remaining roadless areas across the country, including California and places on the Tongass in Southeast Alaska. 9 million acres of roadless areas on the Tongass. Almost immediately, the state of Alaska filed a lawsuit. They lost and they kept losing. Roadless areas stayed intact in Southeast Alaska. However, in 2017, the state, with some help from the federal government, pushed for a new rulemaking process to exempt roadless areas on the Tongass from protections under the roadless rule so that they could be open to logging. We have successfully stalled that process now for almost 4 years. The Forest Service made their final rule about a month ago, and so we filed our lawsuit just before Christmas against the roadless rule. Today, the Roadless Area Conservation Act was reintroduced into Congress, and Audubon's California chapters helped me actually advocate for the RACA, the Roadless Area Conservation Act, back in August. And so we're going to be doing some more outreach efforts this winter and spring now that the bills are being reintroduced in both the House and the Senate. And what that legislation would do is permanently protect all remaining roadless areas around the country. So it would take the 2001 rule and create legislation around it. So they would be legislatively protected areas. So that's exciting. In the meantime, we'll wait to see what our lawsuit does as well. If the lawsuit, if we win in court, that means the Forest Service has to start over on this process, which we are not sure that they would do now that they wouldn't have the political favorability at the national level. If we lose in court and we don't get legislation passed, we still have some opportunities to protect old growth areas on the Tongass through planning processes, because the roadless rule will require a major rule change and they'll have to amend the forest plan. And so we still have the ability to advocate in the forest planning process. So those are the big issues. And so we're going to be focusing on places where we have the biggest impact, outcomes that we can achieve, and where we have leadership on these issues and where we could have leadership in the future. So I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to be doing in the Arctic and on the Tongass in Southeast Alaska, just to give you a taste of the kind of work that we're doing. I tend to look at our work in terms of climate and public lands, coasts, and community. And with each of these strategies, think about different approaches. So under climate and public lands, we're doing a lot of science work to look at adaptation strategies through migration corridors, places of resilience, places of stabilization. For example, Southeast Alaska, when we look at all the climate models out there, though it will change a lot less rapidly than, say, the Arctic. And so, are there strategic places that we can focus our messaging, our research, as well as our advocacy within our broader campaign areas of, say, the Tongass National Forest, key wetlands or estuaries or old growth forest areas on, near riparian streams where there's intact salmon spawning areas. We're also focusing a lot of effort on lifting up the voices of our partners and individuals who have long histories in Alaska, including our Indigenous partners. And of course, as I've mentioned, we use litigation when needed. Under our coastal work, we are looking at, where we have estuaries of significance, We don't actually have any, like, say, classified estuaries of national significance under the EPA program up here, but it's an area that we're trying to explore. We've identified, in Alaska, over 191 important bird areas. Many of those are globally significant important bird areas. And so what we're looking at doing now is overlaying those important bird areas with wetland conservation. And we're doing a lot of focused work with our communities on looking at outdoor recreation and natural capital for Alaska's future, which is allowing us to develop new partnerships with the tourism industry. And it's interesting, right? Like, COVID has really brought some changes to Alaska that, in a lot of ways is a reckoning that we had coming to us. Our state runs almost 100% on revenue from oil and gas tax. It's about 96%. So, we beat out even Wyoming in terms of how much our state is dependent on oil and gas. And during COVID, I mean, as you've probably seen, we've seen the barrel of oil price, which we hear every day on the radio. It's like one of the first things you wake up to is, what is the daily price of oil per barrel? It'd be so nice if we didn't, if that wasn't our focus, but it is up here. And we've heard every number from, a high of $48 a barrel right now, which isn't that high, to minus $36 per barrel. It actually costs $36 to get a barrel of oil only a few months ago. So COVID has really shifted prices around and created an even larger glut of oil on the market that was already there. And so we've seen a huge drop in state revenue, and that's caused some serious budget challenges in state. And so, for Audubon to really work in a relevant space, we need to be thinking about our conservation priorities and how those also can be, revenue generating for our communities, or at least help us start to have those conversations that are going to be very challenging. I mean, we are basically a boom and bust state, and we're headed into a bust. Some of you may have been hearing about the 30 by 30 framework that's trying to protect 30% of public lands and waters by 2030. This is one of Biden's platforms. The nominated Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, has been a huge supporter of this initiative. It was born out of science from the Paris Climate Accord and earlier UN agreements. And so when we think about 30 by 30, if we want to protect 30% of lands and waters across the US, of course, Alaska is a big part of that. And so trying to think about where should we be thinking about 30 by 30 protections, and what do those protections actually look like? We have federal laws, both the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and the Alaska National Interest Land Conservation Act, that don't let us protect land through federal designation outside of legislation. So we have what's called the No More Clause that was written into ANILCA in 1980 when all those wilderness and national parks were established. It was the last big public lands bill in Alaska, and there was a clause in it that's no more land can be designated except through legislation. So how do we get to 30% land and water protections without coming up against that no more clause? And I do have to give huge kudos to California, because you guys actually have a statewide commitment to 30 by 30, which is amazing. And so we're also doing some work with energy transition. I think there's a ton of potential in this space. We are mostly a rural state. Most of our rural communities are on diesel generators. So our carbon footprint is exacerbated compared to a lot of other states with much greater population sizes than us. Per capita, Alaskans have the 6th largest carbon footprint in the world. That's not, it's not a great statistic. And our supply chain, given how far away we are and how much is imported, will keep us high, but there are a lot of things we can do, particularly in weatherization and renewable energy sourcing for for our electricity and heat that we have not yet explored in this state. And with federal legislation that we think may come forward, there's some opportunities to potentially get some federal funding for, even retrofitting homes. Insulation is very poor in a lot of our northern communities, for example. And so there's some pretty specific ways we could start to think about renewables and reducing our footprint. And we're doing a lot of climate work. So we're taking these campaigns in the Arctic and the Tongass and really trying to focus on areas where we know there's vulnerable species and where threats are concentrated. So our threats like sea ice loss, precipitation change, both heavy rainfall and massive drought, as well as coastal erosion. We have a threats analysis that we just finished up that's on the heels of the Survival by Degrees report, but in the Alaska chapter of the Survival by Degrees report, the climate team had not included a threats analysis for Alaska. So we just finished that up since our variables are very different than the rest of the country. And so we're excited to kind of use this in our messaging. You can look at these maps, and that red spot out there in Western Alaska is the northern part of the Bristol Bay region, and a very important coastal area for emperor geese. And under the 3-degree scenario, under the threats analysis, emperor geese are modeled to actually be completely gone by 2050. And that's a species that spends its whole life cycle in Alaska, and it's an incredibly important food source for a lot of rural communities on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, which is that red spot on the right side map there in Western Alaska. So we're going to see some really significant changes to bird distributions, not only in our migratory species, but in those species that spend the year here. And that's going to create some real challenges with food security over time as well for a lot of our communities. And I just like to throw this one up because in the winter, there's not a whole lot of climate threats for Alaskan birds yet, mostly because we're not expecting any major overwintering distributions to change, although some of them are starting to change. We have American robins that hang out here year round, which 10 years ago when I lived up here was not the case. So we're definitely seeing chickadees and robins and some other species that used to migrate and are now hanging out here. So we may see this map on the right change with time, but for now, under modeled predictions, we're still expecting many of the species to not be here in the winter. And then one last thing I want to talk about, I'll just mention, and then you guys are welcome to ask me questions, is that we're focusing a lot of our work on working more closely with our Indigenous partners. I've been with Audubon about 2 years, and before that, I had a lot of other roles in Alaska and outside of Alaska. And so when I came back to work for Audubon, I was really excited to work more closely with friends of mine who have lived and worked in Indigenous communities for many, many years. And so when we think about a place like the Arctic Refuge, the Gwich'in people, which are of Athabascan descent, and the Inupiat people, which are Arctic peoples that have lived on the North Slope for thousands of years, are both two groups of individuals who have used the Arctic Refuge traditionally for millennia and have become some of our strongest advocates for protecting the Arctic Refuge. But what we need to do after we remove the tax law language is figure out a way to permanently protect the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge. And we're not going to be able to do that without our Indigenous partners. And so Audubon is a founding member of an initiative called the Imago Initiative. And Imago is a term for a butterfly before it becomes a butterfly, and it's in its late larval stage. So the idea is that it's an emergence, a program of emergence. And the idea is to bring together conservationists and Gwich'in and Inupiat leaders to talk about what permanent protection could look like for the Arctic Refuge. And we did our first trip actually last summer amidst COVID We did all these protocols to get into the refuge, and we met with Inupiat elder Robert Thompson from Kaktovik, a small community on the North Slope, and Gwich'in youth from interior Alaska, and a couple other friends who are leaders in the conservation community of Indigenous descent. And we talked about what permanent protection could look like. And it's these kinds of dialogues that, I'm really hoping to grow with time, because public lands issues are so contentious up here. But at the same time, there's a lot of common ground, and working with our Indigenous partners is hugely important. We are a state that's over 25% Indigenous. We have 226 federally recognized tribes, and yet those tribes have gone through a series of colonization events, including corporations, incorporation into native corporations. And so, unlike every other place in the country, tribes in Alaska do not own land. They are not land-bearing tribes. And so that makes it really hard for them to have any voice in public process. And part of our work has been advocating for our tribal leaders to have a voice. And the other, I'm going to just skip ahead here to a final slide. The other thing we're doing, I just wanted to show a couple of photos. We're going to be launching a film in February on the Tongass National Forest, highlighting advocacy of a young woman who grew up on Prince of Wales in Southeast Alaska, which is the most heavily logged island in Southeast Alaska on the Tongass. It's actually also the most biologically diverse given its glacial history. And I have spent a few years working with her on this film project. And so Audubon is going to be one of the big sponsors. So it'll be another potentially cool tool for outreach for our chapters. And I'll make sure I share it with you when it's out. And I had just, I've talked through most of this. One thing I will show you is, because I know Pacific herring are a really important conservation species in California. It's an issue that we're starting to look at more up here. They're state managed, but we have a lot of eelgrass. Over half of our coastline is seagrass or some combination of seagrasses, including eelgrass beds. So it's essential fish habitat, but also incredibly important for a lot of birds. And so this has been a focus of mine for the last year, is kind of reviewing our Tongass National Forest program to look not only at the forest, but also at the estuaries that feed a lot of nutrients into the forest and are fed by a lot of those nutrients from the forest. So I can stop there if there's any questions or specific things you wanted me to talk about while you have me here.
Yeah, Natalie, thank you. I'm so thankful for you and all the work you do up there. We have some questions and comments, and if you'd like, I can read them to you and you can answer them that way.
Awesome. Yeah, I couldn't see them while I was talking, so feel free to ask them to me.
Sure. I will start with, let's see. Deborah wants to know, how threatened is the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge with drilling?
The closest it's ever been to getting drilled. So I don't want to sugarcoat it in that it was really hard to see the bids happen last week. It was almost whiplash, because it was like I was watching the bidding happen live, and then like an hour later everything unfolded on the nation's capital. And what a day, what a week. So we're the closest we've ever been. It is possible, I would like to say not likely, but it is possible that they do get the permit for seismic exploration. So that could happen as early as this winter, which is where they go in with these big thumper trucks and they run these seismic lines and they make these grid patterns on the coastal plain. And We hope it doesn't happen. Like we lost the preliminary injunction, but the judge invited us back to fight seismic once the permit's actually issued, because the permit hasn't been issued yet. We're hopeful that that doesn't come to it. Like literally we're coming down to 5 days left of them being able to take any administrative action under the current president. They've said they are going to get the leases done and the seismic permit issued before Trump leaves office, but we're just like fingers crossed that that doesn't happen. So it's literally like, it's kind of amazing how close it's all come. If we had had 4 more years of a Trump administration, I would be telling you right now that, you know, our strategy is 100% litigation at every single turn. So we had all these potential litigation points teed up if we had had a second term of President Trump, because yeah, it was fortunate that it took them this long to get things moving to the point where it's like literally coming down to the last 5 days.
All right, Cynthia asked, do you know why the big oil companies didn't bid on those leases?
Yeah, and I can share a bunch of links afterwards too on some follow-up actions and some cool stories that have dug into this a little bit. There was actually on All Things Considered on NPR yesterday a discussion about the Arctic Refuge, and they had Tegan Hanlon on there, who's one of our producers on Alaska Public Radio, and I thought she did a great job. So if you go back, you could listen to it. But basically, it's a combination of factors. Definitely one is price of oil and futures, oil futures. In terms of the outlook, doesn't look like it's going to change. The public pressure has been incredible. And the companies have spoken about how, you know, they know that they're going to get litigated at every turn, that the permitting process is going to be super controversial. And then the big financing banks, 5 of the largest banks that finance oil and gas drilling in a lot of parts of the world, have said they will not finance drilling in the Arctic Refuge. And so it's a combination of those factors that they say led the large companies to not bid. It's also an unknown quantity of oil and gas. We don't know how much is there, so it's already a bit of a guessing game.
That's interesting. So Vince and Cynthia both brought up the point about if you could let us know whenever you need help in the form of action letters or, you know, calling our representatives, that kind of stuff. You could reach out to us so that our chapter can help you out there.
Awesome.
And Deborah also asked if the Audubon Alaska has a staff attorney, or do you have access to one?
Great question. We do not have an attorney on staff. We usually partner with Earth Justice. So the lawsuits I've listed off to you, in every one of them except the Ambler Road, we're working with Earth Justice attorneys, and our Ambler Road case is the Trustees for Alaska, which is an Alaska-based nonprofit law firm. However, Audubon has in-house legal counsel. So Nada Culver, who's our national policy, public lands policy lead, she's a lawyer by training, and so she can provide litigation support in terms of like advice. And then Lorraine Scala is our national legal in-house legal counsel. But we don't bring litigation ourselves. We work through attorneys, and Earth Justice is our usual partner up here. And NRDC. Usually we work in parallel with them.
Vince asked if you can explain the amount of money that the residents in Alaska get from the oil revenue.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, it's about 96% of our tax base in terms of state taxes. So we don't have any state sales tax or state income tax. Plus, we get a permanent fund dividend every year, which can be as much as like $1,200 or as little as $600, which is a check that every single resident gets. It was not originally set up to be a way to pay off Alaskans for allowing oil and gas drilling, but that kind of is what it's become. It's really interesting though. It's like, you know, you see all this information about universal basic income, and actually the Alaska PFD is used as an example of that. And so, you know, there's pros and cons to it, but we don't have any other tax base other than what we get from oil and gas revenue, and then what we also get from federal subsidies. Alaskans don't like to admit it because they like to say that they're super independent, but we actually receive about $8 billion a year from the federal government for our state functioning, which is more than any other state. Yeah, there's been a lot of push to try to get a state income tax and or sales tax. And we just have an entire state contingent in our legislature that doesn't want to go there, as you can imagine. So we have a reckoning coming where something's going to have to give.
Deborah asked if there are any possibilities for geothermal or even the use of tides for energy, especially for the rural and coastal communities.
Yeah, no, great question. So I was thinking of including it and I didn't, but there's about 15 communities that are exploring kind of large scale renewables. And then there's portions of the state like Southeast Alaska, most of the communities are on hydropower, natural hydropower, not dams. And there's some wind power in Western Alaska. Kotzebue and Nome have wind power generating stations. Tidal-based energy is being explored in Southwest Alaska, actually in the Bristol Bay region. We don't have any large-scale tidal projects here, but we have some small ones to look at that. Geothermal, again, Southwest Alaska, kind of out on the Aleutian chain that's very volcanic, and interior Alaska near Fairbanks, there's some exploratory geothermal projects to kind of look at what it would take to actually harness geothermal. So we think, it's possible we could be 100% renewable. We're about 25% there. And with some of these shifts, like getting communities onto alternative energy, which, wouldn't be a huge lift. A lot of communities are less than 100 people. We could see some pretty significant changes to our carbon footprint, but also just our energy grid.
All right, well, that was the last question in the chat box, but I'll go ahead and open it up if anyone wants to unmute themselves and any questions or comments for Natalie, feel free.
This is Vince, I'm Cynthia's husband. I spent 3 weeks in Fairbanks, like about 4 years ago. Amazingly life-changing experience for me personally. Can you explain what the tundra melting means to both the environment and the infrastructure? Because when you're up in Alaska in the summertime, you have maybe a month to do all your road work. Meanwhile, the permafrost is melting and the roads buckle. How is all that going to kind of affect the infrastructure, and both in terms of cost and then of climate change with all that more methane coming up into the environment?
Yeah, great question. And yeah, I mean, it's huge, right? Like last year, the Denali Park Road, which ended up not being a huge issue since the park largely wasn't open because of COVID, but a huge portion of the Denali Park Road near an area called Polychrome Pass just sloughed off because of the permafrost, the weakening permafrost layer. And it was an example of, what's happening all over the state. We are always doing road repairs because, through large portions of the state, about 2/3 of the state, we are sitting on permafrost, and there's a huge chunk of the state in interior Alaska around Fairbanks that's on what's called discontinuous permafrost. So it's not as thick of a layer as the North Slope. So, when you talk to climate scientists, they're like, oh, the permafrost in the Arctic, it's melting, but it's going to take a really long time because it's feet and feet and feet deep. But where there's going to be a lot of changes very quickly is those areas like slightly north of Fairbanks and south, that discontinuous permafrost layer. And it's something that, we talk about as colleagues, that there should be some kind of added requirement on any industrial development project, any road project, any remediation project that takes into account the long-term cost of maintaining, say, the Ambler Road. If you're going to put a road that literally cuts through a major region of discontinuous permafrost, how are you going to remedy that every single year as the soil below it just melts? And with methane, it's been really interesting as we've been trying to monitor and calculate, Alaska's contribution to carbon storage. And yes, we store a lot of carbon in our soils, but methane is released, and that's 4 times the concentration of carbon dioxide. And as permafrost melts, methane's released. But then there's this other complicating factor of, as permafrost melts, we may actually see new wetlands form because of the standing water on the surface. They're going to be shallow wetlands, but they may offset some of that carbon release from the methane and the melting permafrost. So it's a lot of unknowns. And I mean, that's where we keep seeing the Arctic feedback loops are exceeding any estimate that's been out there in terms of the amount of warming. Like, we had no idea that in 2021, we would be seeing winters where the sea ice does not touch the land. And that's exactly what we've been seeing for the last 4 years. So we're exceeding expectations, not in a good way. Oh yeah, attempts to use the free methane for energy. It's definitely being explored, but there hasn't been any really large scale attempts to look at that, because there's a lot of uncertainty around exactly how much is going to be released and how rapidly it's going to be released.
Any questions? Oh, Vince.
So I have one more. So there's been a lot of talk about the Arctic Sea exploration by Russia, and Canada and the US are kind of using their 25-mile borders. What's been the status of any offshore oil exploration, especially above the North Slope, since there is not that much sea ice that's being kind of coming back in the wintertime?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So Obama had actually prevented a lot of offshore. About 96% of Alaska's offshore is still closed to drilling, even though Trump tried to rescind the Obama era rule. However, a lot of the nearshore, the Obama rule was the offshore, like kind of just off the continental shelf areas. A lot of the very nearshore areas were allowed to be, are still open for oil and gas drilling. And those are a lot of the really nutrient rich areas. So in the United States, it's a little convoluted. However, huge cost to doing offshore. And so if oil prices don't go up, we don't anticipate there being a huge push from that from our country. However, as you say, with sea ice melting, we now have open water all year long. And Russia has been bringing their icebreakers into Alaska waters, trying to establish perimeters to say that, this is open water and therefore can be Russian territory, and they could open water drill in some of those areas just off the continental shelf. So there's there's a lot of huge questions around how aggressive Russia or other countries may be in establishing these open water territories in the Arctic Ocean, because it's a space that until a few years ago wasn't an issue. And so Lisa Murkowski, our senator, who domestically has been pretty pro oil and gas drilling, is part of the US Arctic Commission. And when you listen to her speak to the international community, she's very pro protection, because she doesn't want to see other countries coming in near Alaska waters to offshore drill. But it's definitely an issue that as a country we will have to address in the coming years. And the Obama administration had been really aggressive in kind of having negotiations with Russia and some of the other circumpolar countries on territories and oil and gas drilling offshore and off the continental shelf. Under the Trump administration, we just haven't really interacted in that space. And so we're hoping that we start to see more engagement, because we are seeing a lot more Russian ships in Alaska waters.
I have a question. This is Jessie. 1978, actually, way back. I rafted the Tachansini and Alsac rivers, spent 2
Oh,
on the rivers, and that's such a gorgeous area, the Yukon and the British Columbia area. Is there any projection to any kind of oil drilling there at all? Do you know? I know
not
it's changed dramatically since I've been there. The land has.
yeah. Oh, that's so wonderful. So when I'm not
Time experience.
when I'm not in Anchorage, my real home is Haines,
Oh,
at the on the mouth of the Chilkat River.
Hey, do you know
Yeah.
close by any chance? No.
I don't know, but it's always worth asking. No to oil and gas drilling. However, I didn't really speak to it, but there is a huge proposed mine in the headwaters of the Chilkat River. It's called the Constantine Palmer Project. And one of the links I can send you is a short video about this proposed mine. It's not as large as the Pebble mine, but in terms of the watershed, the shape of the watershed, as you know, those are really incredible steep glacial valleys. And so the impact of the mine, if it goes in, would potentially be devastating to one of Southeast Alaska's most important salmon fisheries. And there's some transboundary mining on the other side, on the Canadian side as well. So I didn't talk much about it in this talk, but the question is often pinned to me, well, what happens after oil and gas? All Alaska knows as a state is resource extraction. That's all we've done. And already our state is pushing really hard for mining because we have so many rare earth minerals. So the really hard to get but super pricey minerals are, Alaska is the hot spot for them in the US. And so it's a question I often pose back to Audubon on the policy team. How do we balance the need for renewable energy, but the requirement of rare earth minerals that renewable energy is going to require? The battery banks alone are cobalt and lithium, and those minerals are going to come from somewhere, and Alaska really wants them to come from Alaska right now. And we have the worst state mining laws in the country. So yeah. So mining is the huge issue there. I'd love to say that it was all great and there's no issue, but
I'm worried about that. It's changed so much. The glaciers are glum that we hiked on and everything. It's horrible.
Yeah.
Bart Henderson. He still does the rafting.
Yes, I'm actually on a board with Bart Henderson. Oh, that's amazing.
Oh.
I will.
Yvonne Chenard was on the first one.
Wow. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, he was cool. Sorry. Anyway.
I love those small world stories.
Yeah. Well, I went with Sobeck expedition. No, talk to you some
Okay. Yeah, please do.
This has been great.
Any other questions? This is your big chance to talk to Alaska. Okay, well, Natalie, thank you so much. It did occur to me that we have sanderlings, which winter here, and we never see them from about May to August when they're up way in the Arctic breeding. So that's definitely a bird that we share. And Vince reminded me about the yellowlegs, which he's actually seen up there breeding, and we have them down here in the wintertime. And I know there's a lot more, but those are the two that come to mind.
Awesome. Oh, that's great. Yeah, thank you. I always think of shorebirds because when I go to California for vacations, it's I love going down and watching the shorebirds on the beach. So that's why those are the species that always pop into my mind.
Yeah. So definitely keep us in the loop. If there's, anything we can put out to our chapter, we've got an Instagram that we have a lot of followers, and, of course, Facebook and the whole thing. And it's definitely kind of fun to have a connection with Alaska. So this meeting has been recorded, and we're going to have it on our website. So we'll make sure everybody has a link for all of this. And any of you who are watching this and want to revisit it, just go to our website on the programs page and it'll be down in the archive at the bottom.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I'll be sure to share things with you, and feel free if you see something on if you follow us on social media and you see something, you're like, hey, that's a great post. Like, do you have more photos or video of the Tongass or this or that? Just for general outreach, even if we don't have a specific advocacy ask, always feel free to reach out to me. And it's great to spend a little bit of time with you. I'm so thankful that you asked. Like, my favorite thing to do is to talk to folks who care about Alaska. So
yeah, well, we're super happy to have you. And Bruce is the one who got the ball rolling on that. So thank you, Bruce, for that.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. Well, thanks so much. And you have a friend up here. So if any of you want to come up or come back, just let me know.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, everyone, for attending tonight.
Thank you. It's been
Take
wonderful.
care. Be
Thank you.
well.